to my recital. I am a student at Purchase College in the master's program. This is my first out of 2 recitals that I will be giving. I'm a student of John Faddis on the trumpet. My name is Mike Carr, if you don't know who I am. And this recital is going to be a little different from some of the recitals you may have seen in the past. This recital is going to serve as a bit of a timeline of some of the different directions that jazz has gone in over the years. And in order to really show you that, we're going to go way back in the past. We're going to start in 1927 with some Louis Armstrong. Now, for those of you who aren't as familiar with Louis Armstrong, he was a trumpet player, as you probably definitely know. And some of the things that he really brought to the jazz world were, it's an immense number of things. But one such thing was that a lot of people, when they would play melody, when they would play improvised lines, they would essentially play the melody and just play a few little tiny variations of they would play tiny little variations of that melody. But he came in, and when he would improvise, he was coming up with completely different melodies to the original melody. It was a completely different thing, but it still served that same purpose. And he was making these incredible lines over the chord progressions, and he was coming up with these incredible ideas. He extended the range of the trumpet. He was able to skip around the instrument like no one before him could. And he had this way of swinging on the instrument that was fairly new when he first came along. And so those are some of the biggest things that he accomplished and provided to the jazz world, especially early on. And some of his most famous recordings were with a group called the Hot Fives and also the Hot Sevens. And so we're going to play for you a tune from his work with Louis Armstrong and his Hot Seven. And this is Potato Head Blues. And we will be playing, because of his incredible work, we're going to be playing almost literally a note-for-note transcription of what they originally played to honor the legends. So here we go. Hope you enjoy. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Anyway, but before these guys all move away and we shift gears, I'm going to introduce you to everybody real quick. So over on piano, we got Matthias Schmidt. Over on the Sousaphone, we got Nat McIntosh. Jake Lawless. Over here on the clarinet, we have Alex Smith. You're going to see him. He's a man of many instruments today. Spoilers, sorry. Over here on the drums, we got Patrick Chen. And over here, hiding in the corner, that is Nate Knipscher on the guitar. We got over here on the trombone, Marty Scott, all the way from Long Island. Yeah. And you'll see him on Egg Shaker later. More spoilers. And yeah, that was our Hot 7. So that's our group. And now, so to get more into the history thing, so Louis Armstrong, another thing he did that I didn't really talk about was that he was playing, he played in tons of different bands, not just the Hot 5 and Hot 7. So one such group was Fletcher Henderson's orchestra back in the mid-1920s. And in that group, there was a primary arranger named Don Redman. And Don Redman, he heard Louis Armstrong and the way he swung notes, and he was very much inspired by that, and he started incorporating that into these arrangements for the orchestra. Additionally, Don Redman he codified the instrumentation of a big band that you know of today, those specific instruments in terms of how many trombones, trumpets, saxophones, all those things in the rhythm section. He really helped formulate that at that time in the 20s. And so those two things, formulating the rhythm section and also really being inspired by that swing phrasing, helped lead us into the 1930s, which basically the king of the 30s was the swing era. And in this era, the big band was the biggest thing in jazz. And so there were some amazing big bands. Some examples would be Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Cab Calloway. Shout out to the people watching from Delaware. Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, Gene Krupa. That's just a couple of them. There's obviously tons more. But going more specifically to Benny Goodman, there's a virtuoso trumpet player in his band by the name of Harry James. And eventually, Harry James left in order to form his own big band. And some of the things these big bands did was they would also feature different soloists, because as they had from the inspiration of Louis Armstrong, people were more inspired to start taking these more incredible solos. And so Harry James actually had a famous concerto that he would play with his big band around the late 30s, early 1940s. And we're going to go ahead and play that for you. It's not a traditional concerto. It's not going to be some 15, 20-minute long thing, because back then they were looking to record on records. And records could only hold about 3 minutes of music. So that they were limited by that. Kind of like how people today are limited by 1-minute videos on TikTok, but who's counting that? Anyway, we're going to go ahead and we're going to play you Harry James's Concerto for Trumpet. acknowledge him. Over on the bass now, we have Logan Maxwell, also all the way from Long Island, joined in that one. And so, going back to our discussion about the swing era. So in the 30s, swing was dominating the form, and unfortunately, we were not able to fit a full big band in here and follow COVID protocols, but things happen. So, as you know, in the 30s, the big bands were dominating, that feeling of swing was dominating, but then World War II happened, people were getting drafted into the war, and basically this meant that less people were available not only to play music, but just as an audience in general. So what started happening was jazz musicians were they were just playing for themselves. So they were just going to these different places in New York. They were just going, jamming with each other, just really nerding out on music. And some of these people were really leading a charge when it came to just trying to find a new way to play jazz. Some of these people were Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Bud Powell, among others. And some of the contributions that they made in terms of their innovations. So number one, for those of you who don't know, a lot of music that we're just playing, those first two songs, the chords are based around either 3 notes or 4 notes. Matthias, can you really quickly show us a triad? Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, and show us if you add another note, the 7th. Exactly. So what these people were doing is, these musicians were doing, they were experimenting with these upper extensions and these extra notes if you start stacking notes on top of that. So can you go ahead and yeah. So as you can see, there's a ton of different notes that you could experiment with and play with. And they started making use of that in their music. And when it came to their melodies, when it came to their soloing, the chords that they were using. Another thing they did, there was a lot of use of chromatic notes in the lines, but they started doing this thing called enclosures, where they'd play 1 note above, 1 note below, and then hit the goal note. And they did that, and that helped really extend the lines that they were playing. And they were also known for playing at fairly fast tempos when they played. They were known for really writing extra complex melodies when they wrote their music. And these things, all in combination with each other, formed what became known as bebop. And so at first, another thing I should mention too, is that there was a recording ban around this time. So not only did you have less people to hear the music or perform the music, you had people unable to listen to recordings. And so people were just completely shocked by what they heard once the recording ban was lifted, when people were coming back from the war. They had no idea what they were listening to. It was this whole new sound. And actually, to be honest, at first, people didn't really like the sound they were hearing. But eventually, people caught on, really enjoyed what they were hearing, and really enjoyed it. So we're going to demonstrate, going back to Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, we're going to demonstrate a tune that they did called Hot House. And this is actually on the slow side for bebop, even though it's going to sound pretty fast. And you're probably going to hear some of these things that I was just talking about in terms of the elements of the music. One more thing I should mention. Another common thing of the bebop era, they would do this thing called contrafacts, where they would take the chords of one song, and then they would write a completely different melody over it. And so this Hot House right here is actually a contrafact. It's the chords of a famous Broadway show tune called What Is This Thing Called Love? And they created a new melody. You could think of this sort of, if you've ever seen the video, The 4 Chords by Axis of Awesome, it's kind of like that concept, but for jazz. But anyway, we hope you enjoy. 1, 2, 3. Alto's Hot House. Really quickly, I do want to acknowledge we had on Alto's saxophone Eric Stein, who apparently goes by the name Chewbacca. And
Thank you.
yeah, and he will be coming back later for some more saxophone playing. And as we go into the history, so that represents the bebop era. As people moved out of the bebop era, they saw that people were doing all this fast and crazy stuff with all these different chords and their lines on the instruments. They wanted to go the complete opposite direction. And you had several different movements that were going after that. So one such movement, the goal was to make a softer version of bebop music. And they're just basically slowing down the tempo, just playing with a more relaxed feel. And this was known as the cool jazz movement. And sometimes they would play with a greater number of musicians and have more structured arrangements with what they're playing. Another movement you had were people who actually pretty much kind of ignored the bebop era and took their inspiration from the swing era and kind of skipped two things. And so they just extended off of that rather than the bebop. And that was another thing. And both of these kind of represented the cool jazz and the West Coast jazz type of thing, depending on the location and the people. Some of the musicians who played music like this were Miles Davis, Jerry Mulligan, Chet Baker, and that's just, and Dave Brubeck. Those are just a few names. And then there was another movement that kind of saw these other movements, and they thought, hey, we're kind of getting away from what jazz is all about. And they took the bebop thing, and they also wanted to make it slower. They wanted to make it a little more palatable for the average audience. So they created more simple chord progressions and melodic lines, but they also really infused that feeling of rhythm and blues and gospel and soul. And they took all of that to form what was known as hard bop. And one of the first important recordings of hard bop was tuned by Horace Silver and Art Blakey, and it's known as The Preacher. And they actually almost were not able to record it because the manager at Blue Note didn't want to, he heard it and thought, this sounds too corny, like no one's going to want this. And then everyone loved it. They were very insistent. They're like, hey, no, we're doing this. We're recording this. And they did it, and everyone loved it. And here we are in 2021 playing it. And by the way, this represents the mid-1950s now. So we're talking the mid-1940s with bebop. So now we're getting in the early to mid-50s with all this. So we're going to show you The Preacher by Horace Silver. We hope you enjoy. As you can see, we have Alex Smith now playing the tenor saxophone. You're going to hear a lot more of that. Again, that's the hard bop era, and as we moved a little bit past that, so the hard bop era, the cool jazz, the West Coast, all of that stuff, it was still very much based on a bunch of rapidly moving chords going through the music, and you constantly have to be playing over different chord progressions and really rapidly thinking in that way. And there were some musicians out there, a key one being Miles Davis, who kind of came up with the approach of, you know what, instead of focusing on all these different chords rapidly moving like through the music, let's just sit on an entire mode. Not even a chord, just a mode, like the Ionian mode, the Dorian, Phrygian. Those of you who maybe remember taking music theory classes back in the day, maybe this is ringing a bell, maybe not. Go look it up. Wikipedia is right there. You're probably watching on YouTube. But anyway, so they're playing over these different modes rather than just having to move through these scales. And you really take your time over each different mode and really can explore and develop over these different modes. And quite literally, this was known as modal jazz. And one of the first really important albums in the modal jazz vein was Kinda Blue. That was really what set the tone for this style of music. And so we're going to go ahead and play something off of Miles Davis's Kinda Blue. We're going to play for you Flamenco Sketches. This was written by Bill Evans, and unlike the other tunes they have on this album, this actually does not have a melody at all. He literally just wrote down 5 different modes on a piece of paper, handed it out to everyone in the group, and then said, you're just going to play whatever you want over this, just feel it out, and then you just let everyone know when you want to move on to the next mode. So we're going to show you kind of what that music sounded like. We're also going to do some different things with it at the end as well. So let me get set up for this, and we hope you enjoy Miles Davis and Bill Evans' Flamenco Sketches. Hopefully this thing does not fall out. Wouldn't be the first time it happened in a recital. All right. 1, 2. All right, so that was Flamenco Sketches. It was very much a different feel from what you've been hearing previously. And that actually came from one of the most successful jazz albums to this date that still has the most sales of any jazz album out there, as far as I know. So we're going to shift gears yet again. So we haven't really talked as much about Latin jazz. And some people, when they hear the term Latin jazz, they think that's all just one thing. And it couldn't be further from the truth. But really quickly, we're going to talk about just two main forms of Latin jazz that exist. So in this time, in the mid-1950s, you had the Afro-Cuban jazz movement, which was based around Cuban and Puerto Rican jazz, kind of infused with some of the things that Dizzy Gillespie was doing. And that was Afro-Cuban jazz. You also had the Brazilian jazz movement, and that very much was based around, a lot of that was based around the Brazilian samba rhythm. And for this thing we're about to play, it's important to understand what the samba rhythm is and kind of how that led to this next thing. So, Patrick, could you really quickly play a samba rhythm? Yeah. So that's the idea. And you notice it's a very fast thing. And so a lot of times music that has the samba feel, the chords tend to be on the simpler side to make up for the fact that you're moving very quickly and having these complex rhythms. So what happened was, basically they slowed that down, made some slight alterations to the rhythm, and then they started taking some of the American jazz concepts in terms of the chord structures and all those things that had been kind of building up to this point. They took that, combined it with that Brazilian rhythm at a slower tempo, and this helped form the bossa nova feel, the bossa nova style. And one of the first really popular recordings and songs in the bossa nova style was Jobim's Chega de Saudade. And so we're going to show that for you. And we hope you enjoy. Chega de Saudade. As you may have noticed, we had Alex going to his third instrument playing the flute just now. We also had Nate back on guitar. We had Marty rocking the egg shaker. Also, I do want to acknowledge, on the bongos, we had David Clapp, who not only is playing auxiliary percussion today, he is also manning all of the sound, visuals, everything right now. He knew he was doing this as of about 10:30 last night, so huge props to him for coming through. Yeah, so that was that. Again, that was the Brazilian jazz. All the Brazilian jazz really was a huge thing, end of the 50s, early 1960s. There were other movements of jazz as well. You had the free jazz movement. You also had the post-bop jazz. You had the post-modal jazz, all those things. I feel like if I just did a Miles Davis concert, I could accomplish the same timeline. But I digress. Another thing that happened, and this was actually unrelated to jazz, but something that happened was the beat, as you definitely know, no matter who you are watching this, you probably know that the Beatles came around in the 1960s. They came to the US and they hit it big, and everyone loved the Beatles and everyone was trying to be like the Beatles, and that became the dominant form of music at that point. And jazz musicians were struggling at that point. They're wondering, how do we keep up with this? What can we do to stay relevant in this world? And so in the mid to late 60s, you started seeing jazz musicians start to incorporate electronic instruments into their playing. Specifically, Miles Davis was, I'm not going to say he was the very first person to do it, but he was one of the first that really, he kind of influenced everyone in a million different styles. But Miles Davis was a first influencer in that style of infusing all these rock instruments, whether it be electric guitar, keyboard, but also including those jazz instruments. And this style was known as jazz fusion. And we're going to skip ahead to the mid-1970s, and we're going to play you a jazz fusion tune from that era. This is by the Brecker Brothers, and this is some skunk funk. And this is going to be our last tune. It's going to be a big one. It's going to be the nice closer for this nice jazz timeline.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
started the video at the first second and you are still watching and you've watched the whole thing without clicking on another link or doing anything else, wow, thank you. And also a thank you, you have to come out here. Also a quick thank you to all of the musicians who participated in this recital. You already heard their names. If you forgot them, just scroll back and find them. We're not reading them again. Also, if you were watching this and you felt like you knew nothing about jazz before you watched, I hope you feel like you learned a little bit. Maybe you feel more inclined to go listen to jazz. I feel like that's the goal here, trying to advance that genre and really like inspire people to try to check this stuff out, because there's a lot of really cool stuff. And if you notice, we started in 1927, we went to 1975. That's about 48 years, close to 50 years. 1975 to 2021 is almost the same exact length of time. So we explored that amount of time. There's almost equal that amount of time that just hasn't even been touched in this recital that you could still go explore and you can go check out. And even within that 50-year period, there's a ton of stuff we didn't touch upon because you can only do so much in an hour. So, other thank yous I gotta make sure I get. Thank you to anyone who taught any of these people how to play their instruments, because they did an awesome job. Also, thank you to people who taught me how to play this instrument, because I think you did a good job. More specifically, thank you to Professor Faddis for all your help this year. I already thanked, if you were watching, I already thanked you, so you don't get a second thanks, sorry. Shout out to my mom, happy Mother's Day. And at this point, honestly, if you're still watching, I got nothing else, so just turn it off, go do something else. But anyway, seriously, thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.